Welcome everybody to the Law News Network. I'm your host this morning, and for the next couple of hours, Rachel Stockman, also editor-in-chief of LawNewz.com. We have a breaking story to tell you about this morning in the Russia probe. The investigation that is going on right now into possible ties between the Donald Trump campaign and the Kremlin. Paul Manafort, who once ran Trump's campaign, he surrendered to the FBI this morning, and another aide, Rick Gates, who worked for Paul Manafort, also turned himself in to authorities. They walked into the FBI's field office at about 8:15 a.m. with his lawyer. Mr. Gates is the other person that was arrested, is a longtime protege and junior partner of Mr. Manafort's, and they have both been arrested in this Russia probe. A huge development. It's a development we are not entirely unexpected, because the feds did indicate that they may arrest, they may file charges against Paul Manafort. I'm joined by Jonna Spilbor, who's a criminal defense attorney. What do you make of this? Pretty big deal. We're finally hearing about charges in this probe.
But as you mentioned, Rachel, it's not really unexpected. We knew that this was probably going to happen. We didn't know exactly who was going to be implicated in this probe. But I got to tell you, when the feds raid your house, there's a good chance that charges will be forthcoming at some point in the future. And as you know, they did raid Paul Manafort's house. What we still don't know is what exactly is he being charged with, and does it have anything to do with his short stint on the Trump campaign?
And that's going to be the critical question here, because if it just has to do with some of his finances and some of his deals with other politicians as they relate to the Foreign Registration Act, which is, some people say he may have violated, that's a different story.
It is.
If, on the other hand, these charges have to do directly with his involvement with the Trump campaign in either Ukraine or Russia, Trump could be in serious trouble here.
Well, excuse me, and other people could be in serious trouble. But here's the interesting thing, before anybody jumps to any conclusions. When you're being investigated, whatever the investigators find fairly, in other words, if they have a search warrant for one thing and they fairly find information on something else, you can be charged with that too. They might have been looking for A, but they found B, and now he could be charged with B, for example. We don't know, but I'm sure we're soon to find out.
Exactly. It's going to be critical in the next coming hours as we watch to see what happens specifically here, to see exactly what Manafort is charged with. Is it a financial crime? Is it a crime of lying to authorities? Because that also could be something if he lied to the FBI during the course of this investigation. Who else? Are there going to be other charges as related to this? Also, is it a sign, because one of the things we talked about earlier is that Paul Manafort, the fact that he's being charged perhaps indicates he was not willing to cooperate with the feds. Or perhaps they found something else related to him that didn't really have to do with the Trump campaign.
Well, you know what? I think most of the time, if there is enough evidence to arrest somebody, which is not, you don't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? You need probable cause to arrest somebody. If there's enough, usually once you have that toehold, then you get the cooperation from the target of your investigation, because now something is at stake. Now that person has something to lose.
So you're saying that they probably arrest him, charge him first, and then say, hey man, tell us the goods you have on Donald Trump or whoever else is their higher target in this investigation.
Exactly, and then they use that person to gain that information that they otherwise might not be able to get any other way. So there's a little bit of a tit for tat there.
So the very interesting thing is I've been checking my Twitter every minute here to see if Donald Trump has responded via tweet to this. Is he going to continue down the same route he's been going for months and months and months and call this a witch hunt? Is he going to say, you know what? This guy was one bad apple. I'm glad they arrested him. Now we can move on. They've done the right thing. What is your guess?
Donald Trump rarely goes back on a position, right? He pretty much just charges forward no matter what. I think it's really going to depend. He might be quiet if there is some connection between the campaign, because that's what Donald Trump cares about. You have to remember, Paul Manafort has been connected with the Russians for a very long time. So there's a plethora of connection that the feds had to investigate that might not have anything to do with the campaign. That's where Donald Trump's concern is going to be. If it's outside of the campaign, maybe he'll be quiet. and not say anything, because what good does it do?
So Paul Manafort has been under investigation for quite some time for violations of federal tax law, money laundering, and then discussions of whether he appropriately disclosed his foreign lobbying, because he had many clients that were overseas in Ukraine, Russia, other parts of the world, and the question is whether he properly registered those. So we don't know what these charges about. We're just getting the information in. It's going to certainly be very interesting to watch.
My, yes.
What do you expect? So he turns himself, this is kind of just an interesting inside baseball question. He turns himself into authorities. What happens? He gets booked, he gets fingerprinted, they release him?
He'll get booked and fingerprinted. Now, technically, a judge could set a bail amount to make sure. Now, he's a wealthy man, Paul Manafort, with connections outside the United States. That makes him a flight risk. So a federal judge could certainly want to set some sort of bail or some other condition to keep him in the United States to face these charges. I could easily see that. But as a wealthy man, he probably won't have any problem meeting that bail. I would expect something like house arrest, something like an ankle bracelet with GPS monitoring to make sure, turn over your passport, of course, to make sure that he can't get on a plane and leave this country for Russia and never face these charges.
Okay, so let me ask you something, Jonna, because a lot of people that will watching this are probably saying, wait a second, so he got to come in by himself and walk into the FBI's field office and just turn himself in with lawyers? Many of the criminals or defendants in the trials that we cover here at LawNewz, they get the cops raid them, they get arrested on the street, they get pulled over. Is this favorable treatment because it's a white-collar offense?
Not favorable, but this is a white-collar offense, and things are done a little bit differently. Like sometimes you get the option to come in with your lawyer and do this in a respectable fashion. It's still the same process. You're still fingerprinted. You're still mugshot. There's still going to be all of that. But you're doing it, instead of having the cops, bang down your door and arrest you in the middle of the night, you're doing it at a decent hour with the accompaniment of your attorney. And that actually is pretty common.
So he's not necessarily getting any favorable treatment just because he got the opportunity to turn himself in crimes like this, which again, we don't actually know what the crime he is being charged with is, but luckily it's not a violent crime. Most likely. Yeah, it's likely a white-collar crime having to do with finances, money, or perhaps lying to authorities. This is not a crime where you typically bust into someone's house in the middle of the night and arrest them.
Remember the high-profile federal case of Martha Stewart, who I adore. Nobody busted into her house and arrested her in the middle of the night. I mean, it is done in a different fashion, especially when you're not dealing with a violent criminal. And you have lawyers from the get-go helping you through this process.
But it was unusual, Jonna, that the fact that the FBI raided his house in the middle of the night for something like this.
Yeah, now obviously they thought there was some evidence that was going to go missing if they didn't have the element of surprise. And that's why they did it that way. And certainly, you know what, Rachel, I'm telling you, for real, he's been so connected with the Russians for so long. It was almost a guarantee that they were going to find something, two dots to connect, that would lead to some charge. And our big question is, well, what is that?
And again, he'd also been told, there have been reports several months ago that Manafort had been told by federal authorities that he was going to face indictments. So I'm sure this is nothing coming to a surprise for him. But as we wait in the next few minutes, if we get any updates specifically about what those charges are, or if we hear from President Donald Trump via Twitter or any kind of official statement about his reaction to this, we will be sure to update you. I want to turn really quickly now to the Louis Toledo case. It's a case that we've been following out of Florida involving a man accused of killing his wife and her two very innocent young children. On Friday afternoon, late in the day, we got a verdict, and a really unusual thing happened in court. Take a listen to the verdict.
Let's bring Mr. Toledo out, please. Adrian, I'll poll the jury. You just announced the verdict. You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been notified that the jury has reached a verdict. Before we bring the jury into the courtroom, I would like to say a few things. For those of you who are present here in the courtroom, the jury's job is very hard, and this has been a very difficult case. I'm fully aware that this is an emotional case and that a lot is at stake. I also know that sometimes emotions overcome self-control and discipline. I don't know the outcome of this case, but we're about to find out. I want to urge everyone in the courtroom to keep your emotions in check and not express any emotions during the reading of the verdict. If you don't believe that you can control yourself during this process, I ask you to leave at this time. This is a court of law which requires the proceedings to be conducted in an orderly and dignified manner. You must conduct yourselves accordingly. Bring the jury in. You may be seated.
Your Honor, jury's in the presence of the court. See the jury's lodged.
Thank you very much. Juror number 105, I've been informed that you have a verdict. Is that true? Would you please hand the verdict to the bailiff? The verdict appears to be in proper order. Will the defendant please rise, face the jury, and hearken to the verdict? Madam Clerk, publish the verdict.
In the Circuit Court of the 7th Judicial Circuit in and for St. Johns County, Florida, State of Florida versus North Toledo, case number 2013-102-888, CFDF. Verdict. Count one, murder of Michael Elijah Otto. We, the jury, find the defendant Louis Toledo as to count one of the indictment as follows. Guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment. Count two, first-degree murder of Thalia Otto. We, the jury, find the defendant Louis Toledo as to count two of the indictment as follows. Guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment. Count three, second-degree murder of Justina Suarez. We, the jury, find the defendant Louis Toledo as to count three of the indictment as follows. Guilty of the charge of second-degree murder as charged in the indictment. Count four, tampering with physical evidence. We, the jury, find the defendant Louis Toledo as to count four of the indictment, guilty of the charge of tampering with physical evidence. So say we all, dated in St. Augustine, St. Johns County, Florida, this 27th day of October 2017, Miller, Fort Worth.
Okay, thank you. Juror 105, is the verdict was published your verdict? Juror number 132, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 130, juror number 26, is the verdict is published your verdict?
Yes, it did.
Juror number 160, is the verdict is published your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 93, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 100, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 152, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 45, is the verdict is published your verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 76, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 62, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 44, is the verdict is published your verdict? Juror number 132, 137, is the verdict is published your verdict? Okay, thank you. You may have a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, based upon your verdict, you'll be required to return to the courthouse next Wednesday at 9 a.m. for the second phase of this trial. I continue to give you the same instruction as I have given to you before. Now, you're going to have a few days open in between now and Wednesday, so it's very, very important that you do not become exposed to any media coverage of the case. You do not do any investigation of the case. Do not talk to anyone about the case until we return, okay? And then at the time, I'll have some additional instructions for you. At this time, I'll go ahead and release you to the bailiffs. We'll take you back to the jury room. Okay, at this time, Mr. Toledo, I'll remind you to the custody of the sheriff to be taken into custody on the charges and hold you in no bond until we have the second penalty of phase of this trial. We need to schedule, I guess, some depositions, and we need to handle some motions. It's my intent to either convene on Tuesday and arrange for all those things to take care of. Would that work out, or Are you planning to take depositions on Tuesday?
We have some scheduled for Monday already for the defense experts, and I know that our experts would like to take an examination of the defendant, I think Monday as well.
So everything is scheduled for Monday?
I think so at this point, Your Honor.
All right. Okay, then I think we need to meet together maybe after this, logistically, to talk how are we going to map out our next week, because my intent to try to get the case done before the end of Friday, the end of business Friday. So before you leave, we'll sit down and discuss as far as how to proceed from here.
We do need you, Judge, to sign the order. We filed the motion.
I have it right here.
Yes, sir. So we can proceed forward, get that on Monday.
All right. So is there anything else we need to address at this point in time on the record before we adjourn?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. If counsel remain, so we can discuss some of the logistics of next week,
Yes, sir.
and then the defendant needs to be taken at this time. This counsel, come on in the back, okay? Huh? In the back, yeah. Don't leave just yet. Why don't you come back?
Judge, I need to recommend something that any court says anything, so I want to say
What do you want to say?
Now, I don't want to waste any more of the court's time, so I'm going to let you know right now my schedule. I'm going to waive the case against my attorney's wishes. No matter what they tell me, no matter what decision they come to me, I'm not going to change my decision to waive litigation. The only waive litigation, no matter what my attorney says.
Okay, we'll have to sit down. I want you to still talk to your lawyers.
I mean, not talking to them.
Well, you know, you may be making that decision based upon emotions right now. You really need to talk to your lawyers, and then I'll have a time where I'll sit down with you, and then we will discuss this matter at length, so I can explain to you what the ramifications of your decisions are. I don't want you to make that decision right now, okay? So I want you to sit down, meet with them, talk to them, and then have questions for me. And then we will have a moment where we will sit down and discuss this matter, okay? Right now is not the time. All right, go ahead and remove it.
And welcome back, everybody, to the Law News Network. I'm your host this morning, Rachel Stockman, and you were just listening to the verdict of the Louis Toledo case, a case that we were following out of Florida, where Louis Toledo was found guilty on all counts of killing his wife and their 2 children. There you just saw the verdict. It was about 8 minutes long. In that statement, Louis Toledo made a brief statement to the court in which he asked the judge for death. I'm joined now by Jonna Spilbor, a criminal defense attorney, and Julie Rendelman, also criminal defense attorney, my guest this morning. So excited to have this duo here. Okay, we're going to move on to the FBI investigation of Donald Trump and his campaign. But first, how unusual is it for a defendant to ask for death?
Do you want to take this? Yeah, well, I was just going to say very highly unusual for a defendant to ask for death. And one of the reasons for that is a judge is not allowed to impose the death penalty in all states except for Alabama unless a jury unanimously says that they want it imposed. Well, a defendant in his case could waive his appeal, his automatic appeal in a death penalty case. The judge can't give him what he wants in this instance.
And I wonder if that's really what he wants, or as much as this is kind of a little bit of a show for either the media or whoever, to have some drama added to it. So I'm sure his lawyers will speak to him and advise him not to continue making such statements.
And he didn't say these statements in front of the jurors. I mean, you kind of mentioned this here. A judge can't put a defendant to death. A jury
has to do it. And in most states, it has to be unanimous. I think there might be a few where you only require a majority, but don't quote me on that. But what he could do, technically, he could take the stand in the death penalty phase and say, give me the death penalty.
But that doesn't mean that the jury is going to give him the death penalty. Quite honestly, if he wants a death penalty, the jury may decide not to give him the death penalty.
Even if he says to the jurors, kill me?
It's up to the jury to decide. And remember, I mean, look, I have my own issues with regards to the death penalty, but part of the issue is whether the jury deems that as a just punishment, and if there's an individual that's begging for death, maybe their argument is, well, let him stay alive and live, kind of his life out,
because that's what he wants to die. Might as well make him suffer then in prison. That could be the alternative argument.
Perhaps he's trying to use reverse psychology.
That's what I think
on the jurors. But this case was so ugly. I mean, when you kill innocent children and you have a death qualified jury, I don't think you're going to have to poke them very hard to get them to come to a death verdict.
The only kind of difference in this case, of course, is that the bodies, investigators never found the bodies. So that may weigh in terms of the jurors wanting to put him to death. What do you think, Julie?
I agree. I think it's easier for a jury to come to a conclusion that he's guilty of the crime. I think it's harder, based on the fact that the bodies aren't there, to kind of come to the conclusion that he deserves death. And the reason is when you have the body, you can at least assess whether the death of those individuals was more, and by the way, the death of any child is vicious.
Right.
But whether there's certain types of death that are more vicious than others, and because you don't have the bodies, the jury's left with not really knowing exactly, how these individuals died.
But they did find him guilty in the guilt phase. I wonder if his attorney might be having a conversation with him that goes something like this. Look, why don't we'll say, spare your life if you give up where the bodies are.
To give closure to the family.
If he really doesn't want to appeal this, if he's if he's comfortable with his guilt, maybe that would be something the attorneys could negotiate. We'll see.
Again, this was almost a slam dunk case for the prosecution. I don't think anybody was really surprised that he was found guilty on all counts, because again, they had a police confession where he said he killed the wife. Now, he wouldn't admit to killing the two children, but who else would have done it if it wasn't him? Were you surprised by the verdict?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. I think we all kind of were in agreement. I think people are always kind of nervous when you go into a trial and you don't have the bodies. But as we've talked about before, sometimes there's a circumstantial evidence case like this one where the bodies or not the case becomes overwhelming. This is one of them. So I wasn't surprised at all.
Okay, so let's turn now, thanks so much, Julie and Jonna, to a big breaking story that's happening right now, and that is Paul Manafort and his aide, Rick Gates, have turned themselves into FBI authorities in connection with the probe looking into whether the Donald Trump campaign colluded in any way with the Russian government. I just emailed a copy of the indictment to both of you, to both our legal experts. It says in it that Paul Manafort is being charged, and Mr. Gates is being charged with, among the charges, conspiracy, laundering, failing to register as an agent, false statements. What do you make of this? There's no direct connection, Julie, to Donald Trump in any of this paperwork.
There's no direct connection at all to Donald Trump, and when we've all been kind of waiting to hear if there's going to be any charges that specifically relate to Donald Trump's campaign, and it's not here. That doesn't mean it won't be eventually, but it certainly means that at least as Donald Trump goes, he may have a frenzy of Twitters indicating that he's somehow vindicated because there's no mention of this.
Well, that's going to be the interesting thing, to see how Donald Trump responds. Is he going to continue down the same this is a witch hunt, or is he going to say, see, I told you my campaign wasn't guilty. If you look at the charges, they have nothing to do with me. We're good. What do you think he's going to do here?
At the risk of getting rocks thrown at me via Twitter, what if that is actually correct? I mean, we have here an indictment after a long investigation that has nothing to do with the campaign. It all pertains to, like we spoke earlier this morning. They were looking for a connection between some wrongdoing with Russia and the Donald Trump campaign. Here's the result of their investigation. It's nowhere on the pages. Does Donald Trump have a point?
But let's be clear. First of all, especially when you're dealing with investigations that involve the federal government, investigations take a really long time. And many times with the U.S. Attorney's Office, you'll see that you have indictments that come down and they follow up with additional indictments. So we don't know what's coming down the path. We also don't know if they're going to use this as leverage against Manafort to try to get him to give up that of which relates to Trump. And so we just don't know where this is going next. We don't know if more people are going to be indicted. But I agree, as it starts, it's not headed in the direction of Trump. Although a lot of these charges relate to time periods that are starting to kind of get into the time period of which he was supporting the campaign.
See, I don't see that. I don't see that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the documentation, and we have posted the full indictment if you want to read it on LawNewz.com, it mentions a time period, and I'm trying to pull it up right now, when the alleged crimes occurred, and it includes the time 2006 through 2015. And then it says, in order to hide Ukraine payments from the United States from approximately 2006 through 2016, Manafort and Gates, the co-defendant, his aide, laundered the money through scores of United States and foreign corporations, partnerships, and bank accounts. Of course, Manafort was Trump's campaign manager in 2016 when this was happening. That doesn't mean, of course, that Trump had any idea that Manafort was allegedly laundering this money, but it's certainly interesting timing that it's not like from years and years ago that this was happening.
Well, some of the charges talk about 2017 as well. I mean,
because of lying to the FBI?
Yeah, and count one, when we talk about conspiracy, it's from in or about 2006 and 2017.
But the feds only started talking to Manafort because they wanted to get a connection between him and the Russian government and the campaign. So that's when they were talking to him. That's when Manafort would be lying. They weren't talking to him before that. So to me, that's a red herring, if you recall that term from law school. And I barely do, but it seems to fit right now.
And we have much more, again, on our website if you're looking to the details of this. But we did know for a while that Paul Manafort represented a Ukrainian political party whose leader was Viktor Yanukovych. And that's where some of the troubles began, because instead of correctly reporting the payments he was receiving, this indictment alleges that he basically funneled it through all these different corporations, millions and millions of dollars, in order to evade paying taxes and to get the money. This complaint also alleges that he went on to live a lavish lifestyle, buying all sorts of things using the money he had illegally funneled. What do you make of this? How hard are these type of crimes, Julie, to prove? Is it pretty easy when you have a paper trail?
I mean, you do have a paper trail. And
you have to.
So, look, we always say when the federal government indicts someone, usually it's airtight, and the defense attorney is, trying to kind of figure out some way to poke some hole in it. I think that, the fact, by the way, that they came forward with this, and, this can go into what you're talking about, that they've avoided anything in regards to kind of the Trump campaign, may be indicative that this is the strength and of their case, and they don't have enough. That doesn't mean they don't have anything with regards to Trump. They just they're usually pretty careful in making sure that their cases are airtight before they really start exposing the public and the community to information in regards to what they may or may not have.
So tell me if you two agree with me on this. As I read it, and again, we just got a copy of this indictment, and it's somewhat lengthy, so we haven't read every word. But as I read it right now, the only way really this could be used to the detriment of Donald Trump or any of the people working for him is leverage on Paul Manafort and Gates to give up information on others. Because based directly on what we're reading here, there's nothing linking the campaign.
No. And you are correct, but think about the practicality of that, right? So let's say that's where the feds are going with this. Okay, we got you on. We have a paper trail of all this money laundering and all this conspiracy and all that good stuff. Now, what we really want from you, Paul Manafort, is to tell us how you connected Donald Trump to Russia during the 4-month period that you were the campaign manager. Give us all of that. Now, here's where that argument fails for me. It would have been here, like they would have found something. So it would be a complete shot in the dark to now say, what do you got on Donald Trump?
But
you disagree.
But that's incorrect, because this is an indictment. So the indictment is not going to include areas that they believe there may be additional evidence that they don't have enough evidence to indict yet. They're basically making out charges that they have sufficient evidence to go forward. They may additionally have other evidence
That they're not putting forward.
Exactly.
Ladies, they found evidence from 10 years ago. You don't think that they were looking for a connection and it's not here. To me, that means it doesn't exist.
All right, not to toot my own horn here, but I do want to for a second, because back in July 25th, 2016, I wrote an article that's on LawNewz.com that says Paul Manafort was once sued by the former Ukrainian prime minister for scheming and money laundering. She alleged in this complaint, I'm not kidding, the exact same thing that's in the indictment. She sued in federal court because she was the opponent of Viktor Yanukovych. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. The lawsuit was thrown out of federal court because I believe some jurisdictional issues. But much of what we see in this indictment has been known since Trump had hired Paul Manafort, because it was all put out in a 2014 lawsuit filed by Yulia. Okay, I'm going to totally butcher her name, but she was the former Ukrainian. She was the former Ukrainian prime minister that ran against Paul Manafort's the person he represented, the client. Mm-hmm. So does that change things? The fact that was all out here.
I think we all, and I don't want to speak for anyone, we all agree that Trump tends to surround himself with people that he, that at the end of the day have backgrounds that are quite sketchy, to say the least.
I disagree with that too. That's okay.
I understand that, but
that's good. Why do you disagree?
Well, because I don't think he surrounds himself with sketchy people. That's like calling everybody who voted for him a basket of deplorables. I think that if there was some sketchiness in one of his people's background, if he found out about it, then he would have gotten rid of that person. And that was the other question that we had. I don't remember the exit strategy of Paul Manafort from the campaign. I want to go back and look that up.
I believe he was forced out. I don't remember the exact.
He was forced to resign, as I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, look, the fact that if Trump knew about it and still hired him, that doesn't rise to the level of a criminal act. That rises to the level of a naive and foolish act.
Stupid hire. Why would you hire someone that you knew had this background?
And again, can I play devil's advocate? My role will be devil's advocate this morning, I think, clearly. But let's say, for example, I'm going to hire you as an associate, and somebody had sued you, a client had sued you in the past, and that complaint was dismissed. I wouldn't hold that against you. Client sued you, complaint was dismissed. I wouldn't see.
But I don't know that I hate to undevil's advocate you, but I don't know that I disagree with you. People get sued all the time. It doesn't necessarily rise to that level.
So by analogy, is that lawsuit that was dismissed by a Russian authority something
it was filed in federal court, actually, here in the
something
US.
that Donald Trump, if it was dismissed, why would it be a consideration of his? Is my point.
Right, I understand that. I think, look, some people say where there's smoke, there's fire, though. And if this individual was involved for this many years in trying to, be involved in not only money laundering, but lobbying for another government, then one starts to wonder, well, what, if anything, did he possibly do in regards to what was going on with the campaign with Russia?
Well, again, we are just getting word this morning that Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, and Paul Manafort's aide, Rick Gates, have been charged with a slew of crimes. You can read about the indictments on LawNewz.com, but some of the more serious charges include money laundering, making false statements to the Department of Justice, and also conspiracy. We are going to be talking more about that in a few minutes. In the meantime, I want to switch over to the Louis Toledo case, because that is a case where we are going to see the death penalty phase begin this week. He was found guilty on Friday on all counts, including second-degree and first-degree murder, for killing his wife and the two children. Let's listen to some of the prosecution's closing statements, closing arguments, I should say. I always get on people that say statements instead of arguments. Let's just listen to some of the prosecution's closing arguments, and then I'll bring my guests back to talk about it.
Idea where he's at. In the same interview, he said that no one else was at his house the night before. And he said that things had not become physical between him and his wife. The next day, he changed that story and admitted that he lied about that. More inconsistencies by the defendant in his statements. More consistencies on when he said he first saw Tyshawn Jackson that night and what he was doing. In his interview on October the 23rd, he said that he saw Tyshawn Jackson pulling up at 9 o'clock and 1 a.m. And when he was specifically asked, he specifically denied seeing Tyshawn Jackson at 3 a.m. The next day, on October the 24th, he said that Tyshawn pulled up around 2 or 3 in the morning. In the same interview, he changed his story, and it wasn't that Tyshawn was pulling up. He said he saw Tyshawn come out the front of his house with a flashlight. And in the same interview, he then later said that he saw Tyshawn come out of the house with Mr. Biggs, the dog, and that Mr. Biggs sleeps with the defendant. We heard testimony from Tyshawn's mother says that's not true. Mr. Biggs sleeps with me. I'm the one that lets him out, not Tyshawn. Here, and within 24 hours, the defendant is changing his story. He can't keep it straight on when he saw Tyshawn Jackson and what he was doing. Details matter. More inconsistencies in the defendant's statement on where his cell phone was during the time of the murder and the cleanup. On October the 23rd, he said that Yesenia Suarez took his phone after their argument, after the phone call with Kevin Dredden, and he got mad and he left. He says that she took his phone away from him because she was afraid that he would call Kevin Dredden. And he said that he didn't have it when he left for work the next morning because she had taken it. But on October the 24th, he told investigators that it was in his car. And he thinks Tyshawn took it when they went to dump the car off. Again, he can't keep his story straight. More inconsistencies by the defendant on how Tyshawn wound up going into the defendant's home. And this explanation, not only inconsistent, it just simply doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He said in the interview on October the 24th, when he's blaming all this stuff on Tyshawn Jackson, he said that he saw Tyshawn Jackson at 3 o'clock, again, inconsistent with what he said before, and that Tyshawn Jackson accepted his invitation to come into his house at 3 o'clock in the morning to play PlayStation 3 with him. And not only to come inside of his house to play his video games, but to come into his bedroom where his wife was sleeping at 3 o'clock in the morning. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He said he told Tyshawn, I don't care if she gets upset. Come on, let's go. And he said that Tyshawn Jackson, he accepted that invitation. They walk into the house. He walks into the bedroom with him. He turns the light on. And he said that when Yesenia saw Tyshawn, that's when she went off. And he even said that before she went crazy, that Tyshawn grabbed one of the PlayStation 3 remotes. And if you remember from the crime scene photographs taken by Josh Mott, the PlayStation 3 remote control was found in an armoire inside the master bedroom on the other side of the room in a corner. It meant that Tyshawn Jackson had to go fully into the room, walk across the room, and touch and grab the PlayStation 3 remote control in the bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, you heard Tyshawn Jackson. He said that he's been over the defendant's house and he's seen Yesenia Suarez get upset on occasions. And he says whenever that happens, he's uncomfortable. He gets really uncomfortable and he leaves. The defendant, the day before, on October the 23rd, also told a story to the investigators about how Yesenia Suarez got upset one day about some car repairs that her father was doing for them. And there was some dispute about the fact that they thought it was one problem, and they get in there and they find a whole bunch of other problems, and it cost a bunch of more money or what. But she was very upset about this, and Tyshawn Jackson was present when she got upset. And the defendant said that Tyshawn Jackson, she blew up so bad that Tyshawn Jackson got uncomfortable with. Even the defendant says, this is not something that a normal person does. Yeah, okay, I'll go inside your house. It's 3 o'clock in the morning? Sure, no problem. What, you want to go in your bedroom and play video games while your wife is sleeping? Sure, that doesn't sound like a problem at all. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. More inconsistencies by the defendant on why he went back into the house and what led up to the killing of his wife. On October the 24th, he said, fuck it. I know my wife hates when I play PlayStation 3. That's her most hated thing. She hates that. So I told Tyshawn, fuck it. We ought to go in the house and play. I don't care if she gets upset. He said, I was pissed. I was trying to get her upset. He's telling Tyshawn Jackson this. And Tyshawn Jackson just, oh, sure, no problem. We'll go, we'll have a good time. And then later in the same interview, he says, I should have never went inside. I should have just slept in the car like I always do. I really felt like she needed another chance. Well, which is it? Which is it? Were you going in there to get her upset, to make her mad? Or were you going in there to give her another chance? Which was it? He can't keep his story straight, ladies and gentlemen. More inconsistencies on why he went back in the house and what led up to the killing of his wife. You heard the testimony of Sabrina Newell, and you heard the phone call that he had with her on May the 2nd of 2015. And in that phone call, he tells a very different story of what occurred in the house that night. His story had nothing to do with the video games and why Yesenia Suarez went off on him. What he told Sabrina Newell on May the 2nd of 2015, that when they got into an argument, she says, you need to get the fuck out. And he was like, yo, you're acting like a real, you know what? He told Sabrina Newell, you know she hates that word. And she's like, yeah, I'm a real good, you know what? A real good blank too. And she says, I'm such a good hole, that's why I sucked his blank. And you know she doesn't do that. I said, yeah, you sucked his blank. I said, well, you remember when I was in Alabama, when you was in Alabama, that Nani, which Sabrina Newell says is Yesenia Suarez's sister Emily, says, well, you was in Alabama, Nani came over here, remember, yeah, that's why her blank tastes like Skittles. And that set her off the roof. That's why she started coming at me, attacking me. Then everything else happened from there. And then he says, I can't keep talking about it because I'm already talking too much. He's telling a completely different story of what occurred that night. A story that makes complete sense when you stop and think about everything that led up to that night. And then suddenly him and his wife get into an argument. And she throws this in his face. And it drives him over the edge. More inconsistent statements by the defendant on whether he cleaned the house. We've heard this before. The 23rd, he said the house smelled good that morning. It didn't smell like last night. On the 23rd, he said the last time he cleaned the house was about a week ago. But on the 24th, he admits, I cleaned everything. He said he used whatever chemicals were in the kitchen to clean the bathroom. He said the cleaning product smelled by the deputies was from the cleanup. He said the house is really, really dirty, and that's why he had to use the rainbow. And he also described wiping down the walls, removing the rug, scrubbing the shower and tub with a green scrub pad, and used mean green, Pine Sol, and other detergents in the rainbow. More inconsistent statements by the defendant on who was with him when he dumped the rainbow. On October the 24th, he said that after Tyshawn Jackson came back from the first trip, the alleged first trip, after he dumped the bodies and some of the other stuff, he says, we dumped the rainbow. I dumped that stuff right there. He was referring to photographs that the investigators had showed him of the rainbow vacuum cleaner. I dumped that stuff right there with him. In the same interview, he says Tyshawn was not with him when he dumped the rainbow and the stuffed animals. He dumped it after he had already dropped Tyshawn off at the 9/11, and that statement was true. Tyshawn Jackson, said that there was only one trip where we dumped stuff off. He can't keep his story straight. He said that he realized the rainbow was still at the house after he dropped Tyshawn Jackson off. More inconsistent statements by the defendant on who decided to dump the truck mat from Yesenia Suarez's black Honda. On October the 24th, he said after they dumped the rainbow, I told him we got to go back because this piece here, he's referring to photos of the trunk mat, was going to show them where that they were in the trunk, and we went back to get it. He says that I said, we got to go back and get this thing. In the same interview, he said, Tyshawn told me to turn around because he forgot the trunk piece. So I went back and picked it up and I wiped it down and put it in the back seat. Again, he cannot keep his story straight. More inconsistent statements by the defendant on when and where he got rid of Yesenia Suarez's ring. And I don't know that you may have heard this, but if you listen to that interview, he talks about getting rid of Yesenia Suarez's ring, how he went to her job and he confiscated it. And he says that on his October 24th interview, he said that Tyshawn told him to throw his wife's ring over the I-4 bridge going into Seminole County. He said he threw it from the left lane. In the same interview, he said that when he was driving back home, now going into Seminole County is when they're going to dump the car. And then he says in the same interview that they're driving back home on Highway 1792, not on I-4, but 1792, that Tyshawn saw the rings and told him to get rid of them over the bridge. Almost immediately after he says it, he changes it up and says they were not going home, but they were going towards Sanford on 1792. And he said that when they were going to get rid of the car, they were driving all the way up and down 1792. Which was it? Was it I-4? Was it 1792? He can't keep his story straight. And what's more, saying that he was going towards Seminole or Sanford, and Tyshawn Jackson sees the ring and tells him you need to get rid of the rings, was a problem with that. And that's because when they were driving the car to dump the car in Seminole County, he was in the black Honda and Tyshawn Jackson was in the silver Saturn. How could Tyshawn Jackson tell him to get rid of the rings on his way to Seminole County? It's not possible. He says they didn't have cell phones, so there was no telephone conversation. It doesn't make any sense. And he's changing his story. And this is the same interview. The same interview. Because we're on I-4. No, we're on 1792. He can't keep his story straight. On the knife, we've already talked about this. On the 23rd, he saw the knife in the photo and said it was his, so he saw it 2 days ago. There would be no reason why it wouldn't be in his house. And then on the 24th, he admitted that he threw the knife out the window. Now, a note about this knife. It is true that there is no forensic evidence that connects the knife to this particular crime. And so you may ask, what's so important about the knife? I know that question has been asked several times and probably asked of you again. Some arguments will probably be made about that. But here's the important thing about the knife. Number one, why is the defendant throwing it out? Number two, we don't know how the victims were killed. We don't know that because the defendant disposed of that evidence. We don't know. We have to accept at some level some of his statements about how they died, some of which sort of strains credulity, talking about how he karate chopped his wife to the throat and she immediately died with one blow. But we don't know. We know they're dead, and we know that from the evidence the defendant killed them, we don't know how he killed them, other than what he said. We also know that the defendant cleaned up and did a pretty good job cleaning up. It wasn't a perfect cleanup job. He left some of Talia Otto's blood behind, but he cleaned up the crime scene. And so we don't know. Why is he throwing the knife out the window? Even if the knife wasn't a part of the crime, it certainly shows a guilty mind. Other evidence that's been presented to you in this particular case that shows that the death of these victims were caused by the criminal act of Luis Toledo were statements that he gave that are inconsistent not just with his own statements, but are inconsistent with the evidence in the case. He said that he left Felicia Perez's house and went straight home and started packing, and Yesenia came home shortly thereafter, and they discussed separating or staying together. And he didn't leave until she refused to tell Kevin Dredden's wife about the affair. We talked about this already. He left her, you heard testimony that he left her house around 6:30, but there was no evidence in the house. You saw the pictures from the crime scene, the house. You heard testimony from Josh Mott, the crime scene investigator. There was no evidence of the defendant packing. The only luggage that was found out and about was Yesenia's purple suitcase that she had used for a trip to Alabama. And of course, we know from the phone records that that's not true because Yesenia Suarez is at home calling him over and over and over again and texting him saying, "I'm here, where are you?" It also shows that his phone was turned off at 6:28 p.m. Other evidence, other statements by the defendant that are inconsistent with the evidence in this particular case. The defendant said that while all this cleanup was going on, that Tyshawn went and grabbed some garbage bags over the sink. They went into the house, they found a box of garbage bags, and they dusted them for prints, but Tyshawn Jackson's prints were not found on the box of garbage bags. He said that Tyshawn Jackson drove the black Honda to dump the bodies and other evidence, but neither Tyshawn Jackson's prints nor DNA was found in the black Honda. He said that Tyshawn Jackson, again, this is something we covered, that he covered the front seat of the Honda with plastic all the way down the floor. The only shoe impressions on that piece of plastic had the same size, shape, and design as the defendant's right Timberland boot. The defendant also said that before they went to dump the car off, that he vacuumed the Honda real good with the rainbow before taking it to dump off. But there was a sandy footprint found in the rear floorboard of that Honda, which also, amazingly, a sandy footprint was found in such pristine condition that a footwear impression analyst was able to determine that it had the same size, shape, and design as the defendant's right Timberland boot, just like the shoe wear impressions on the plastic sheet. More statements by the defendant that are inconsistent with the evidence in this particular case. He said that Tyshawn Jackson, this is part of the story, when Tyshawn Jackson was there and Yesenia and the kids were killed and they were in the process of cleaning up and getting rid of evidence. He said that initially Tyshawn Jackson was wearing Nike tennis shoes, faded jeans, a black and yellow t-shirt with a graphic design, and then after he goes off on one of these trips, he comes back and he's wearing a black t-shirt, basketball shorts, and slides. And the video from 7-Eleven shows that Tyshawn Jackson's not wearing any of that. He's wearing a gray tank top. He's not wearing a black shirt. You would think that that was something that the defendant would get right. I mean, Tyshawn J did get his help to move the car, but no. Then, more evidence that's inconsistent with the evidence. He said he went to his brother's house to get him to help move Yesenia's car. And he says that he dropped off Tyshawn. He said he did that after he dropped off Tyshawn around 8 o'clock. But his own flesh and blood brother says that's not true, that he came to his house between 5 and 5:30. He also said that he returned home in the morning of October the 23rd because his gas light indicator had come on and he left his money at home. But investigators went a year and a half, learned to get a quarter of a tank of gas in that car. And his gas indicator light was not on. Was his interview that the defendant committed these crimes based on all of the evidence that I've just laid out for you. Interview 2013 should remove any doubt whatsoever that not only did so his two children. If you remember from that interview, and if you remember from the video, while he's sitting there hunched over, and he's looking at photographs. And the day before, if you remember, he was upset about his description of events. And he was asked, "Do you want me to take the photographs away?" He goes, "No, I want to remember them this way." As you look in this, if you watch this video, you get the sense that their faces are haunting. He's looking at those photographs for a long period of time. Now, the cynic would say, because he requested this meeting with the investigators, he knew full well what he was going to do. And he knew that one day somebody would see it and maybe feel sorry for him. But I submit to you, when you watch that video very carefully, you get the sense that he hasn't had any sleep in 2 days. He says he's looking at those pictures of his wife and his children. How they looked when they took their last breaths. And so he asked the investigators at one point, tells them, I need to go to the bathroom. And they stand there with
And welcome back, everybody, to the Law News Network. I'm your host this morning, Rachel Stockman, also editor-in-chief of LawNewz.com. You were just listening to some closing arguments from the prosecution in the Louis Toledo case. It's a case where we found out from the jurors on Friday that he is guilty, but we are now going to move into the death penalty phase of this case. That's expected to begin on Wednesday. Very unusual thing happened in court where Louis Toledo himself asked the judge if he could be put to death. The judge said, we'll discuss this later. Likely that's not going to happen, of course. The jurors are going to have to make that decision. He would always have the opportunity to perhaps tell the jurors that he wants to be put to death, but this is a decision the jurors are going to have to make. We'll be streaming the death penalty phase of that case live here on the Law News Network. A lot of news going on here as we bring in this beautiful rainy Monday here in New York City. I want to turn to the Harvey Weinstein case, and I want to bring in my guest, Jonna Spilbor, an attorney, and also Julie Rendelman, who's been standing by with us all morning. Okay, we found out on Friday that Harvey Weinstein has sued his own company because they're not giving him access to his own records. That seems wrong. Why can't he get access to his records, his emails? What do you think?
I think he should be. The surprise for me there was when I first heard he was suing his company, I thought it was going to be a lawsuit for wrongful termination because he might have some there.
And he may do that.
Which he may
do. And he might. But here's the thing. So interestingly, a person's personnel file typically belongs to the company. Now, Harvey Weinstein was the company. He was an owner, not just an employee. And he wants to obtain those records because it's going to, A, help him defend in any of the civil/criminal cases that could be coming down the pike toward him. But plus, the company wants to hold it close to the vest because they, too, might have some liability vis-a-vis they allowed it to happen. So they want to hang on to it. Harvey wants a copy of it. I think that Harvey's going to win. Harvey will win this battle, and he will be able to obtain a copy.
But isn't it the company's property?
There's more things, though. There's more issues that he's raising, and one of the things he's raising is that someone from the company leaked that information, that information, his personnel files were his, and they were private. And he's saying that people, accusers, or at least the media, seem to know information that they could only have known had the company leaked it. So he's gone even further by making accusations of either mismanagement or even some type of, actions on the part of individuals that may have purposely gone after him.
Right. Inside his own company.
Right.
Well, and again, because what he's specifically referring to is that initial New York Times report that kind of blew the lid on this whole thing, where in it there's some verbiage in the New York Times report that makes it sound like the reporter had actually seen his personnel file. And this is the report where the initial report the New York Times did before this kind of blew up was that Harvey Weinstein had been accused of sexual harassment throughout his career, and that over a 30-year time span he had settled more than 5 different lawsuits. And in that report, the reporter says that he or she had viewed a file, and I think that's specifically what Harvey was talking about. But it's kind of a funny situation in that Harvey is telling the board he wants the info so that he can turn around and sue them.
Right. Well, I think there's many kind of things going on, because you have individuals that are suing the company, you have individuals that are suing Harvey, you have Harvey suing the company. And one of the things that's probably the most interesting is the people that are suing the company are going to want his personnel files. They're going to want the emails between Harvey Weinstein and any of his alleged victims. And Harvey, on the other hand, is going to want his emails. Now, he may think, and one of the arguments is that he believes that there's emails or some type of correspondence that he has that may, at least in certain
circumstances, exonerate him with regards to certain complainants. And the complainants may believe that there's information in there that will indicate that either that the company itself knew what was going on.
I find it hard to believe that he'll have emails that exonerate him from these rape allegations, but we shall see on that front. Since you're both criminal defense attorneys, I want to get your take here, because we've heard these allegations coming out. More and more women have come forward. Do you think there's any chance that this man could face criminal prosecution, Julie?
I don't. Again, it depends on several factors. The time period of which the alleged incidents happened and where they happened, because each state has their own specific law in regards to the statute of limitations. And so I think a lot of those factors are going to come in. Obviously, the AG's office seems to be in New York is indicating that they are going forward with an investigation. So maybe they will come up with something. But I personally, if I was to take a guess, I don't believe that we're going down the Cosby road.
I disagree, Jonna. What do you think?
I think we are going down the Cosby road. Do you want to know? I think the results of Cosby, which is that there was a hung jury.
He's still being retried.
But it's still, it was an incredibly difficult case to go forward on. And so keep in mind that I'm not saying it can't happen, but it really depends on who the victim is. Look, you have to, as we talk about with any of these cases, when an individual accuses another individual of any type of criminal activity, especially a sexual type of activity, one wants to know, did they come forward originally? Who did they come forward to? Do they have some motive other than money or something like that to go forward? And so it depends on kind of what they come up with.
But I do think there are some stark differences between Cosby and Harvey Weinstein that may make it easier for Harvey Weinstein's case to be proven by prosecutors. And that is, one, all of the Cosby allegations were from years and years ago. Right. Many of the allegations that we're talking to having to do with Harvey Weinstein happened in the last 5 to 10 years. There's that. And B, all of the allegations involving Cosby, these women were on drugs, Quaaludes, whatever. In these cases, these women seemed pretty with it. None of these women have indicated they were drunk. None of these women. So that would also make their testimony more believable in front of a prosecutor. So that's I think that that a prosecutor would have an easier case.
They might have an easier time bringing the charges, but what I think the similarity between Cosby and Weinstein, they both will claim, or Cosby did claim, was all consensual, and consent is a defense to
all
rape.
Of these women, 58 women, it was all consensual?
No, and I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that's what his defense will be.
Yeah.
Right, and also remember, I think at the time, at least with the complainant that they went forward with for trial, she did come forward initially. I understand it's been a lengthy period of time, but she did come forward and make a complaint at that time, and the DA's office chose not to go forward. Similarly, I mean, we had a case in regards to Harvey Weinstein where a complainant came forward and the DA's office again chose not to go forward.
And let's talk specifically about that case. And Julie, because I sent you info on it, and you helped. Were quoted in one of the articles on LawNewz about this. And this was a case where an actress came forward, I believe it was in 2015, reported that he had groped her, Harvey Weinstein, in New York City. They got her wired up, and she had another encounter that was all caught on audio tape, where Harvey basically says, and we have to go back and read the verbiage, but he kind of admits he did it. He said, I won't do it again.
I'm sorry, I won't do it again.
Okay, so isn't that enough for at least a misdemeanor crime in New York?
It can be, and one of the things we talked about is I'm not here to second guess the DA's decision whether they should or shouldn't have gone forward. The issue that came up with regards to that specific case was the basis of the DA saying that they couldn't go forward was simply because of that controlled call. And that was the problem that a lot of the attorneys that were looking at this case and reporters that were reviewing this had the problem with saying, well, that makes no sense. The controlled call made the case stronger. The DA's office may have had information that none of us have about either the woman or anything regarding that case itself that none of us know about. And so I'm not here to second guess whether they should have gone forward. I'm questioning their reasoning as to why they didn't go forward.
I mean, I guess the only maybe we don't know something about the wiretap and how they got permission to get the wiretap. Could that have been part of it? We don't know.
No, I think and again, this is one of the issues they said was that had the NYPD come to us, we would have told them how to do this control call. Well, I have to be honest. I mean, we have cases that come forward all the time where I represent criminal defendants who it's her word against his. You don't even have the benefit of a controlled call, and they go forward. And that's why people were really questioning the DA's office in terms of their decision. Was it Harvey Weinstein's power? Was it the fact that there were contributions made to the DA's office? All these things kind of became food for discussion because people become concerned when someone of power ends up not getting arrested for this type of crime. But again, when you're at the DA's office and you're doing an investigation, there are things that perhaps you know about that we don't. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know if entrapment may have been an issue. Like maybe that tape was not going to come in for some reason. So if it's going to get suppressed, then let's not bother with the charges because it's just going to end up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. Not to use a pun, but maybe that had something to do with it. Or if I'm thinking of the correct call, right? Was it the call you're talking about where he was in a hotel room and the woman in question was visiting him at that hotel room? And he's trying to coax her inside the hotel room.
He's trying to get her to come up. Come on, sweetie. He was doing.
There was also allegations against the woman, or not allegations, but there was something more about another incident that had occurred with another individual where she had made claims that maybe there was a question as to whether those claims were valid. So there was
what's
more to this
interesting
case.
about all of the Harvey Weinstein allegations is they follow, and again, not to use a pun, but they follow a similar script.
Right.
They're all in a hotel room, and when you listen to that tape, and I encourage folks viewing this to listen to it, you kind of can see how he went about his way manipulating the women, making them feel his MO, making them feel really guilty. Come on, honey, don't embarrass me. We got to do this. So it'll certainly be interesting to see what happens with that lawsuit. Again, Harvey Weinstein has sued his own company, the Weinstein Company, trying to obtain personnel records. The question next, is he going to sue them for wrongful termination? He also makes some claims in there that they may sell for a price that's not justified, given all that's going on. And of course, he'd make less money if that were to be the case. So we'll continue to closely monitor that case. In the meantime, I want to turn to another huge story that just broke this morning, and that has to do with the Mueller probe into possible ties between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Now, we keep saying that the New York Times, all the major publications keep saying that's what the probe is about, but we just heard the first charges come up against Paul Manafort, Trump's ex-campaign manager, and Julie and Jonna. They have nothing to do with Donald Trump at this point, from what you've read of it.
Right, and that's the surprise in all of this, because you have to remember the purpose of this probe really was to investigate whether there was a connection between whomever and the Trump campaign way back when. And instead of coming up with a direct connection, there was a whole plethora of other stuff that got dredged up in connection with the investigation that has nothing to do with the campaign. I think that bodes well for Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump might be sitting pretty right now because, like we talked about earlier, they did such an investigation that if there were some there, it would be in this indictment, and it's not.
But the feds are notorious to keep everything close to the vest. They don't want folks to know.
Well,
right?
they were supposed to keep things close to the vest, yet everyone knew that there was an indictment coming, which indicates that there was a leak as well. But, when you say instead, I don't know that it's instead. I think it's too early to tell what's going to happen next. And, yes, I think that initially, if I were Donald Trump, I'd certainly be happy that there was no allegations and no charges in regards to Russia. But I think I'd be a little premature to be too happy about what's going on just yet.
And again, what's kind of amazing about all of this is much of this was out in the public before Donald Trump hired Paul Manafort. So for the life of me, with all of the talented people in Washington, D.C. that could have been Donald Trump's campaign manager, it just makes you question. That's the one thing it makes you question. Why did he pick this guy? And that's more of a political question than a legal question. Yeah. But
as an employer, I've had that same talk to myself on occasion.
Yeah.
I've selected people that didn't work out for one reason or another. And this could have been one of those things. Now, he was not the campaign manager for very
He
long.
wasn't.
It was,
No.
A 3 or 4 month period of time, and then
But
he
because of
exited.
this, he ended up leaving. You know, he didn't leave. He didn't just leave on his own for no reason.
No, I don't think he left on his own for no reason.
Right.
But again, the whole purpose of this Russia probe wasn't to find out what people in the campaign did 20 years ago. The whole purpose was to make a direct link, and right now we do not have one.
And again, if you're just joining us and you haven't heard the news, you probably have, but if you haven't, Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign manager, and Paul Manafort's aide, Richard Gates, were both charged as part of this Russia probe for conspiracy, money laundering, failing to register as an agent, false statements, among a slew of other charges. When you look over this indictment, what do you think are the most serious charges, Julie, that he's going to face?
They're all pretty. They're all pretty serious, and they're all pretty airtight. I mean, again, I don't think any of us have been able to fully go through every single thing
Since we've been sitting here.
But it seems that there's a money trail regarding, several of the allegations, and then it seems that the biggest problem he has is even after he's committed these crimes, he then lies to the DOJ in regards to everything that happened. So even though these crimes seem to be older, they seem to be much more relevant because he continues to lie about them up until 2016 to 2017.
And so where most recently he got caught up in charges is when he was interviewed by either investigators with the FBI or investigators with the Department of Justice in both 2016 and 2017. And apparently, according to the feds and according to their indictment, he made false statements to them. How serious of a crime is that to make a false statement to the FBI?
As they say, oftentimes the cover-up is worse than the crime, right? Because
Right.
that in and of itself is a crime. Can I just touch on one other thing that I think is really interesting about this indictment that we've been looking over, and it's still warm? The amount of evidence that they put in here, like you don't have to, they didn't have to include, they've got transaction after transaction after transaction.
Totally.
They didn't have to do that. They could have made a little bit more of a general accusation. And I don't know if that's for the public's benefit or if that's to scare the defendant, like this is what we got, so you're not weaseling out of this.
Well, I will say as a pacer junkie, that's what I like to call myself as a reporter. Like I was obsessed with checking pacers, so I've read a zillion different indictments on people, federal indictments. This one is particularly detailed.
Very. Sure.
Most of the time, you're not going to get all these attachments where it says payee, transaction, originating, account holder. It will be a little bit more generic.
Yeah.
I mean, usually indictments are pretty substantial with the
Which
feds.
they need to be, right.
Which they need to be. However, they don't oftentimes include the actual evidence in the indictment. That is unusual.
I think one of the issues, though, is that they're well aware that the public is looking at this, and so they want to be as detailed as possible to at least give the public confidence that when they went after this guy, that they have the case. When just one side thing, when we're talking about what crimes are more serious, crimes when we're involving money, the more money, the more potential sentence he has. And so there's a lot of money that he seems to have been taking, whether it be money laundering or enjoying, whatever life of luxury he had. So those charges are and can be extremely serious.
And again, we're not talking about a couple of $1,000s. According to this indictment, he illegally funneled millions of dollars through offshore bank accounts, various corporations, and failed to report that to the IRS and pay the proper taxes like he was supposed to do. And of course, that's what always gets people when they try to do something like this and don't report that income to the IRS.
Sure, and the lobbying claims.
Of course, yes.
And where he lied about those claims, not recently to the DOJ, but back then in terms of the companies and stuff. So that's on top of everything. There's additional. He seemed to be very active during those years. In regards
So
to
I'm
the
really
Ukraine
curious
company.
to see his defense, because how dumb can you be? I'm sorry. How dumb can you be if you know the feds are going to be able to get subpoenas and get your bank records? Why wouldn't you just be upfront to the feds when they're asking you questions about it?
I always go back to O.J. Simpson. I think you start to believe your own crap. You know, am I allowed to say crap? But you start to, it's like you got away with it for so long that you think you're Teflon. And so I think people start to think, oh, there's no way they'll go after me. And that's when these events happen. They think, you know, somehow that they're immune for prosecution. Quite honestly, sometimes they think because, and in this case, because they were working with Trump and the Republican Party, that perhaps they would be protected in that way. And that's when things go awry and you end up getting indicted, you know.
Well, what if Manafort plays dumb? What if he says, I had tax accountants, I had other professionals helping guide me, make sure that the regulations were being followed. I didn't do this all on my own. They were the ones they were my advisors. They told me I was doing everything above board. Why are you indicting me now?
But that's interesting. Except there's a problem with that, and that is that, you know, at least with regards to lobbying, it's clear that there are certain statements made by him and his, whether it be his partner or Rick Gates, that clearly indicate that it's him and Rick Gates and nothing to do with anyone else. And then in regards to the DOJ, there's clear lies in regards to what he was involved with that aren't totally involved with kind of the taxes issue.
Well, unless he, like Jonna said, legitimately didn't know some of how his finances were being dealt with, and so he thought he was telling the truth to the DOJ. Anyway, I think we're all thinking about thinking like defense attorneys right now. Here's another interesting thing. So when we were during the campaign and we were all following the investigation into Hillary Clinton very closely, James Comey, the current FBI director at the time, came out and to much criticism gave a press conference basically exonerating Hillary Clinton. Well, he didn't totally, but saying that he wasn't going to recommend charges. Are we going to see a press conference by Robert Mueller talking about some of these charges? Because it's unusual for Comey to have a press conference to say he's not going to charge, but it's not entirely unusual when you have actual charges for an FBI director, although he's a special counsel, or a district United States attorney, to come forward and give a press conference. Could we see something like that?
I think we could. Look, if I were advising him, I'd tell him to keep his mouth shut, and let the indictments speak for themselves when and if they come. You know, I think that Comey got himself in big trouble with regards to a lot of the things he opened his mouth about. You know, can it happen? Of course it can. By the way, in this day and time, I think anything can happen. So nothing surprises me anymore.
We're a very vocal society. Or is Paul Manafort going to want his attorney to make some sort of statement without violating the publicity laws to say, you know, my client is innocent, or, you know,
well, that all depends, perhaps on whether there's some kind of agreement that we don't know about, that maybe Manafort's going to be helping the feds with their investigation.
Well, obviously he's known about it for a while because, you know, they served the no-knock, you know, search warrant on his house quite a few months ago. He was well aware that they were after him. I'm sure his attorney was, you know, engaged in conversation with the prosecutors way back when. So I'm sure there's much going on behind the scenes that we don't know about.
Let me ask you guys about this. You might not have heard of it, so I'll just give you some background. When the FBI raided Paul Manafort's house, one of the things they took, and Paul Manafort put a big stink up about this, is they took records that Paul Manafort said were protected by attorney-client privilege. In other words, there were some kind of communications between him and his attorney. They seized those records, and apparently they gave them back to Paul Manafort after he put up a fuss. But here's the thing. Who knows? Maybe someone already, you know, one of those agents looked at them. Doesn't that kind of taint the investigation a little bit?
I would think so. Number one, attorney-client privilege documentation is sacrosanct. Can't be used against you, shouldn't be gathered in connection with a warrant. And there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. If the attorney were in cahoots with Paul Manafort and they were conducting some sort of crime together, then it's off the table. But otherwise, Paul Manafort had a legitimate concern about those, and those records would not be able to be used. My problem with it then is if you look at something you're not supposed to see, and that leads you to something else, now you're widening your net. and it's almost like fruit of the poisonous tree. And that could have happened here, but we won't obviously know that yet.
Right. Obviously, there's an ethical obligation on the part of the prosecutors and on the part of the detectives to not use those things which resulted from or are clearly attorney-client privilege. I think the perfect example we always use is Riker's calls, because on Riker's calls, prosecutors listen daily to calls between defendants and family and friends, but they're not permitted to listen to calls between defendants and attorneys. But very often the prosecutors accidentally get a hold of them, and the question becomes exactly.
And then
the
your
question
client
becomes,
admits
can
to
you
it.
listen to it? And if you do listen to it, obviously you can't use it against the client. But you're not supposed to even be listening to something
And then
like
how
that.
do you unlisten to it? How do you unsee it? Let's say it gives you a lead, and then you happen to call up someone you saw in the documents who says, yes, Paul Manafort did X, Y, and Z. It's in this bank account overseas. Check that out. And then you find the documentation.
But one of the problems is, and this is probably when a judge should come into play, is that, who decides whether certain things are attorney-client privilege? There's certain conversations or certain notes that we can call attorney-client privilege, or we can call work product as an attorney, but that doesn't make it so. And so sometimes the best decision is to get a judge perhaps involved to do kind of an ex parte reviewing of, not ex parte, a review of the specific in-camera review. Sorry, I forgot my words. That can review it and make a determination as to whether the prosecutor is entitled to it or not.
And from what I understand, because I did write about this specific incident a couple of months ago, is how they works with the FBI is they have a person that actually reviews everything first before then it's handed over to the investigators. So there's some kind of intermediary. But again, if they read some documents that were attorney-client privilege, and what I find interesting, this hasn't been made a bigger deal of, because I think that's a pretty big deal.
I do too.
If the feds go and raid your house and they take something that they shouldn't have, even though they gave it back.
But I don't know, how would they necessarily have known that they couldn't be taking it? I mean, do you know what I mean?
Well,
simply because an individual claims that something is attorney-client privilege doesn't make it so. And so part of the reason to do a search warrant is because you're gathering that information of which the defendant himself isn't willingly turning over. Now, quite honestly, for me, I'm more shocked that at this stage where he clearly knew there's an investigation into him, that he hadn't made sure things weren't lying around his house that could hurt him in any way.
And he'd be charged with that, right? That is, but
perhaps.
Yeah, I think the attorney-client privilege is sacrosanct, and the only person that should even have a hint of whether something is or isn't is a judge to make that call before it's seen by any party to an action, and I'm guessing that didn't happen here either.
As far as I know, no. But again, the results of this, from what I understand, is the feds returned the documentation that they claimed was protected by attorney-client privilege.
Gee, thanks.
I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes more of an issue as we move forward. Also depended on how much of the information they used to indict Paul Manafort was gathered through that FBI raid. So again, if you're just joining us, of course, here on the Law News Network, we are following breaking news in the Russia probe. Two people, Paul Manafort and his aide, have been indicted. They are facing a slew of charges, including conspiracy and money laundering and making false statements to the Department of Justice. We have more information about this story on LawNewz.com. In the meantime,